Brian Hoytland was once a brave soldier who devoted himself entirely to his country. However, fate led his life into a different path when toxic chemicals from the military infiltrated his body. The effects weren't immediate, but over time they turned into dangerous autoimmune diseases, gradually destroying each organ in his body. His heart, the most crucial part, was not spared from the devastation caused by the malicious illness. After many years of fighting illness, Brian had to learn how to live with constant pain and weakness in his body. But on one fateful day, January 15th, 2017, his heart could no longer endure. His body began to fall into severe heart failure, pushing him to the edge of life and death. Although he had experienced heart failure episodes before, this time the feeling of despair was entirely different. That day, he was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The doctors acted quickly to save his life. For 7 hours, Brian lay in the emergency room, struggling with pain and the approach of death. They transferred him to the ICU. Things worsened. His heart began to beat erratically and soon entered a state of paroxysmal tachycardia. Critical condition could lead to death. In the ICU, Brian felt as though his body was being worn away by the pain. His heart ached and every beat became heavier, as if each beat brought him closer to the end. Although he had faced many hardships in his life, this was the first time Brian truly felt life slipping away from his body. He knew that his time was running out, that death was very near. In that moment, Brian prayed. He no longer had the strength to continue fighting. The pain had drained all of his willpower and determination, leaving him with only one desire, to be free. He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer to God, asking him to take him away, where he could no longer bear the agony. Strangely enough, although Brian was not someone who easily gave up or surrendered to anything in life, now he only wanted to escape it all. When Brian closed his eyes, felt a strong vibration and then a pop within his body. That was the moment his soul left his body. All the pain disappeared in an instant. Although the sensation was brief and painful, it was nothing compared to the suffering he had endured for so long. It felt like the final blow that released him from the physical world, taking him into another realm. When Brian's soul left his body, all the sounds around him vanished. There were no more machines, no more rushed voices in the hospital, nothing but absolute silence. He felt a wave of love and joy enveloping the entire space. However, when he opened his eyes, what lay before him was not a bright scene or paradise, but a dark space, like a vast void. That space was pitch black. No stars, no light, nothing visible except a blanket of darkness. Yet, Brian still felt a strange warmth, as if the love and joy were still radiating around him. He stood there, in the middle of this void, feeling as though the emptiness was calling to him, trying to pull him further in. Brian felt the pull of the dark void, but at the same time he realized that this was not a place of love and joy. It was a deceptive lure, a trap meant to lead him to a place that was not good. He sensed that this was not where he truly belonged. The love and joy he felt did not emanate from this space, but were merely the residual presence he had felt before. In that moment, Brian decided that he could not step into this space. He did not want to spend eternity in this endless void, a place without God, without his light. He wanted something more. And as he made that decision, he suddenly realized that there was a radiant light behind him, a light he had not noticed before. Brian didn't know exactly when this light appeared. Now he could feel it more clearly than ever. It seemed as if the light had always been present, but only when he rejected the dark void did he become aware of it. The brilliant light emanated warmth, love, and joy he had never experienced. It was an indescribable light that made him feel at peace, safe, and full of hope. Without needing to turn around, Brian could see the light. A strange thing happened. He could see both the light behind him and the dark void ahead. He realized that in this world his vision was not limited like it was in the physical world. He could see everything around him, 360 degrees, without needing to move or turn his head. The dark void still existed, but the light behind him was what truly captivated his attention. Brian Hoytland was still bewildered after his soul separated from his body, feeling the absolute silence around him, so different from the chaotic sounds in the hospital. He stood before a vast dark void, like a universe without stars, without planets, without any source of light. Everything seemed to be swallowed by endless darkness. But strangely enough, he could still clearly see this undefined space, even though it had no specific shape. That dark void looked like nothingness, but it wasn't completely empty. Brian felt that it wasn't just an empty place, but as if it was alive, a kind of presence that was watching him and beckoning him. Part of him sensed that this place was trying to pull him in, but not for anything good. It had a malicious purpose. He felt the pull but simultaneously sensed that something was wrong. Brian stood confused before the deep, dark void. The feeling of love and joy was still present around him, but he knew it didn't originate from this place. He tried to look deeper into the darkness, trying to understand what this place truly was. But the more he looked, the more he realized it was a deception. It tried to convince him that this was a place of peace, where there was no more pain or worry. But Brian knew that true peace did not come from here, as this place had no God, no light from God. In a profound moment, he decided that this wasn't where he wanted to go. This dark void wasn't his final destination. No matter how much love or joy it promised, Brian knew he couldn't choose to step into a place where there was no God. That decision made him look back, and in that instant, he saw a brilliant light. This light was unlike anything he had ever seen in his life. It wasn't just a regular beam of light, but one that radiated love, joy, and absolute peace. At that moment, Brian no longer struggled. He knew he had to go to that light. The miraculous thing was that he didn't need to turn around to see it. He could see the light, even though it was behind him, without needing to move. He felt that his vision had changed and was no longer limited by the physical constraints of his eyes. He could see everything around him, in every direction, without having to turn. The light became even clearer as he made the decision to leave the dark void. Gradually he realized that he no longer felt the pull of the darkness. The darkness was still there, but it no longer had any power over him. The light behind him was his true destination, a place that held everything he yearned for. An intense feeling emerged in his mind. He wanted to go to that light. He knew that was where he belonged. In an instant, Brian was standing before the radiant light. Strangely enough, he didn't feel any movement. He didn't feel like he had traveled. No push, no wind, or any sensation indicating he had crossed a great distance. But in a fleeting moment, he was standing before the light. It wasn't just light. It was the living presence of something far greater. It was a feeling that couldn't be described in words, a feeling he had never experienced before. That light emitted a gentle warmth that spread throughout his body and soul. Brian didn't need to shield himself from the light because it didn't hurt his eyes, unlike the sun or any other source of light in the physical world. It was entirely different. This light wasn't just physical light. It was pure and absolute love. That love had no limits, no conditions, and Brian felt it deeply in every cell of his body. Standing before the light, Brian realized that all the pain and struggles he had endured throughout his life suddenly seemed unimportant. This light had erased all feelings of pain, worry, and Brian felt as though he had been wrapped in a warm blanket on a cold day. It was a feeling of safety, being sheltered and protected. He knew that this light was not just any light. It was God. Brian Hoytland, after standing before the radiant light of God, clearly felt that he had entered the divine presence of the Almighty. This light wasn't just a physical source of light he had known in life. It was a symbol of pure love, affection, and God's eternity. In that moment, Brian understood that all the pain, worry, and fear had disappeared, replaced by absolute peace. Brian stood there, completely awestruck by the vastness of the light. It seemed to have no limits, no end, and it continued to spread endlessly. Every beam of light touched every corner of his soul, dissolving all anxiety and unease. Brian knew that this wasn't just ordinary warmth or peace, but the divine love of God, something that was hard for humans to describe in words. In that light, Brian felt a powerful connection to God that he had never felt before. He knew that this love wasn't just for him, but for everyone. God's love was unconditional, limitless. It was there for anyone willing to open their heart and step into his presence. As Brian immersed himself in the light, he began to see his life more clearly than ever before. Everything he had experienced, from the good to the mistakes and sins, appeared vividly before him. However, what was strange was that he didn't feel fear or regret for his mistake. Instead, he felt an immense forgiveness and mercy from this light. He knew that God was showing him his life, not to judge or punish, but to heal and bring peace to his soul. And then, in that radiant light, Brian recognized the presence of another figure, Jesus. Jesus didn't appear in the physical form of a man as Brian had imagined, but he knew right away that it was him. The presence of Jesus radiated powerful, overwhelming love. He stood there as the source of the love and light enveloping Brian. When Brian saw Jesus, a deep sense of gratitude flooded his heart. He realized that everything he had gone through in life had led him to this moment, the moment he stood before the Savior. And although Brian knew he had made many mistakes in life, Jesus did not judge him. Instead, his eyes were full of love, forgiveness. In Jesus' light, Brian began to reevaluate his entire life. Every action, every thought, and every choice he had made appeared clearly before. But instead of feeling ashamed or guilty, Brian realized that all of these things had been forgiven long ago. Jesus showed him that he had always been beside him, watching and walking with him throughout his life's journey, whether Brian realized it or not. Every step Brian had taken, whether right or wrong, was part of God's divine plan. Brian also realized that his mistakes and sins weren't just fleeting actions. Jesus showed him how each of his actions had affected others, had impacted the world around him. He saw the consequences of his sins, but also saw how God's forgiveness and love helped heal the wounds he and others had caused. Jesus didn't scold or judge. He simply showed Brian the truth about his life and how God's love had always been there, waiting for him to recognize and return. Brian knew that standing before Jesus, there was nothing he could hide. He felt that every aspect of his life was laid bare, not only before God, but also before all the other souls present in heaven. Strangely, he didn't feel shame or fear. Everything was the truth. And Brian understood that this was part of the healing he was experiencing. Jesus continued to shine, and his love flowed into Brian's soul like an endless river. That love not only healed the wounds in his heart, but also opened up a new door for him, a door of understanding and wisdom. In this moment, Brian realized that he wasn't just forgiven. He was given a new divine mission. He knew that the love God had given him wasn't just for him to keep to himself, to share with the world. Brian felt that God was giving him a mission to spread his love to everyone. As he stood before Jesus, Brian Hoytland felt not only boundless love, but also complete forgiveness from him. In that sacred moment, every memory of his life appeared vividly before him. Every action, every choice he had made. But more importantly, he began to see things he had never noticed before. How even the smallest actions had impacted others and the world around him. In Jesus' light, Brian saw his sins, the lies, the hurtful actions, and how they had not only broken the hearts of those involved, but had set off a chain of unforeseen consequences. clearly saw the harm he had caused to those around him and the repercussions that these actions had sown. But Jesus didn't blame him. Instead, his love flowed into Brian's soul like a cool stream, healing every wound. Jesus showed Brian not only the errors of his ways, but also how he could turn around and make amends for what he had done. One thing Brian particularly realized was that every action, every choice in his life, far more profound consequences than he had ever imagined. He began to see the outcomes of the choices he had previously justified. The times he sought revenge, hurt others under the pretext of being treated unfairly, now became clearer than ever. In earthly life, Brian always thought he had the right to retaliate when wrong. But before God, he realized that every act of revenge, every justification for wrongdoing, had only driven him deeper into sin, causing pain not only to others, but also to himself. Jesus showed Brian that these choices didn't just affect the people he directly interacted with, they had far-reaching impact. Every harmful action he took had created ripples that affected many others, even people he didn't know. Brian was stunned by this truth. For the first time, he deeply understood that human life wasn't just a brief string of personal decisions. Everything was connected in a complex web of relationships and consequences. However, Brian also realized that sin wasn't the last thing he had to face. Jesus didn't just show him his sins and their consequences, but he also showed him how to overcome them. Jesus showed Brian that he had always been loved, despite his mistake. The love of Jesus had no limits, and all Brian had to do was open his heart to receive forgiveness. But Jesus didn't just come to forgive. He came to give Brian a new mission, a mission not only to correct his mistakes, but also to spread God's love to others. When Brian realized this, it felt as though he had been reborn. He knew that from this moment on, his life would never be the same. He had been given a new opportunity to live in alignment with the purpose God had for him. Jesus spoke to Brian in a deep and gentle voice, a voice that didn't need to be heard aloud, but that Brian could clearly feel in his mind. He conveyed 3 important tasks to Brian, 3 things he needed to carry out when he returned to earthly life. These tasks weren't just simple guidelines for living, they were divine missions entrusted to him. The first thing Jesus told Brian was, pray more. However, he wasn't just talking about the daily prayers that people often perform out of habit. Jesus wanted Brian to live his life as a prayer, to live in love and connection with God, in every action and every word. He emphasized that long or formal prayers weren't what mattered most, but rather the sincerity in each word and action. Jesus wanted Brian to live a life where every act, no matter how small, was done with love and gratitude to God. The second thing Jesus told Brian was, endure suffering with joy. Brian had gone through much suffering in his life, from physical pain to emotional wounds, but Jesus showed him that suffering wasn't something to fear if he accepted it with gratitude and joy. Jesus reminded him that he himself had endured suffering on the cross to save humanity, and through suffering we could find purification and holiness. Brian understood that instead of fleeing from or lamenting over hardships, he needed to embrace them as part of the journey to draw closer to God. The third, and perhaps most important thing Jesus told Brian was, share God's love with everyone. Jesus said that the love Brian had received from God wasn't meant for him alone. His task was to bring that love out into the world, to spread it to others, especially to those who were suffering and lost. Jesus emphasized that every act of love Brian performed could create ripples of positive impact on many other people, just as his sins had once created waves of negative consequences. But this time, he had the opportunity to do the opposite. So love, joy, and forgiveness. Brian deeply felt the profoundness of Jesus' teachings. He knew that these weren't just ordinary words, but a divine mission that Jesus had entrusted to him. He knew that from now on, his life would have to change completely. He had been given a new chance. A chance to do something better. To become an instrument of God's love and mercy. After the divine encounter with Jesus, Brian Hoytland realized that his life would never be the same. He had been given 3 sacred tasks. Pray more, to endure suffering with joy, and most importantly, to share God's love with everyone. These instructions had been etched deeply into his soul, becoming the guiding light for the rest of his earthly life. When Jesus told Brian that he needed to return, at first he hesitated. After experiencing the peace and infinite love in God's light, he didn't want to return to a world full of pain and uncertainty. He felt the pull of heaven, where everything was filled with love and forgiveness. But then when Jesus asked him a very important question, "Why do you want to return?" Brian realized that he still had a divine purpose on earth. He understood that God's love wasn't meant to be kept in his heart, to be spread to others. At that moment, Brian understood that he wanted to return, not for himself, because he wanted to share what he had learned, spread God's love to others. He wanted to help others feel the love and forgiveness that he had experienced. His decision to return wasn't to escape suffering or the challenges of life, but to fulfill the divine mission that Jesus had given him. As soon as he came to this clear understanding, the light slowly began to fade, and he found himself standing before the dark tunnel, the very path he had left to enter heaven. But this time, the tunnel was no longer frightening, no longer pulled him into uncertainty. Instead, at the end of the tunnel, Brian saw the hospital room, where his body lay, with doctors working frantically to save him. Brian found himself standing in the middle of the tunnel, and he understood that now he needed to return. He felt a strong connection to his body, but was also fully aware that when he returned, he would have to face the physical pain he had endured before. However, this no longer scared him. He knew that the suffering was only temporary, and that he would have the strength to overcome it. God's love had filled his soul with endless joy and hope. Then, in just a moment, Brian felt himself being pulled back into his body. The return was so quick and unexpected that he barely noticed the movement. When he opened his eyes, everything around him suddenly became noisy and chaotic again. Sounds of machines, voices of doctors rushing to save his life, and the pain from his body, breaking down due to heart disease, all flooded back. But this time, despite the pain, Brian felt a profound joy in his heart. He knew that suffering was only a small part of his journey. Although his body was enduring agony, his soul was filled with God's love and hope. When he opened his eyes, he saw himself surrounded by doctors, and immediately he whispered, "I just died, didn't I?" The doctors, still working to save him, looked at him in surprise. They confirmed that he had been clinically dead for over 10 minutes. Somehow, he had returned. Brian realized that his body was no longer the same. He had to endure terrible pain from heart failure and the wounds from the life-saving surgery. But that no longer mattered to him. What mattered was that he had been given a new mission, and no matter how painful, he would carry it out with all his soul. Brian recounted that he lived 2 more years after the encounter with Jesus, before he received a new heart through a transplant. And during that time, he lived with the love and mission Jesus had entrusted to him. Shared his story with others, not to seek fame or admiration, but to spread God's love to others. He wanted people to understand that no matter how painful or difficult life could be, God's love was always there, waiting for them to return. Brian knew that his life wouldn't last much longer, but he had lived it fully with the mission God had given him. He no longer feared death, for he knew that when the time came he would return to God's light, to live in eternal love and peace.